So on to the presentation. Why are we meeting here today? In order to kick things off with our POW election campaign, we wanted to give you a little bit more insight into how the EU and the EU Parliament works. And to do so, we invited some of our Science Alliance members, Markus Frischhut and his colleague Andreas Maurer. Markus Frischhut is a Jean Monnet Professor teaching and researching at Management Center Innsbruck and is also adjunct professor at the University of Bologna. In his work, he focuses on EU law, EU health law, EU values, as well as the relationship of EU law and ethics. And Andreas is a professor for political science and EU integration studies and head of the Department of Political Science at the Institutional and Procedural Development of the EU, multi-level parliamentarism, EU trade, and international agreements policies. And now that we are already late, I'll say welcome again, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the organization of this event. Just a quick question, you can see the screen. Okay, so I guess nowadays, before the upcoming elections of the European Parliament, there are a lot of events, and I'm happy that also POW Protect Our Winters has as one of its objectives to disseminate knowledge about the European Union and about the EU elections. And I'm also happy that my colleague Andreas Maurer was willing also to be part of this session, because I guess he's the expert on the European Parliament. He's written a very comprehensive book together with some other colleagues. So if you want to have someone who is an expert for the European Parliament, it would be Andreas Maurer, and I'm very happy that we can do this together. The two of us, we have agreed that because my background is in law, would give you first a little bit of legal insight. He might jump in whenever he has comments, and then he would give you the political science perspective. And obviously, those are the two perspectives that you very often need to understand topics. So they are mutually related, so to say. So let me very briefly introduce myself. I already mentioned maybe the most important. So my background is in law. So whatever topic we're going to look at, it will be a legal perspective. And in my work have focused besides European Union law also on the relationship of EU law and ethics, and also values. And as you might know, democracy is one of the values of the European Union, and that's what is now coming up with the elections to the European Parliament. The title is Why the EU Matters, or Why EU Elections Matter. And before we go into the details about the European Union, I think it's always very important to start with the question, why has this integration process been kicked off? And nowadays, with the war in Ukraine, I think we appreciate peace even more. For a long time, it has been forgotten that at the very beginning, this was a peace project, and I guess it still is, where France, who was attacked by Germany during the Second World War, after the World War, tried not to repeat mistakes made in history, but said, okay, let's work together with those who have attacked us. Let's make war materially impossible. And let's do that via economic integration. So first takeaway, I think it's very important even today to remind ourselves that this is and was a peace project. And second, that it was done via economic integration. And in that regard, the EU is all very often seen as very neoliberal or sometimes in a negative way. But it is important to remind ourselves that this is developed step by step, and nowadays includes a lot of different topics. And so at the very beginning, we had cooperation in the field of coal and steel. Nowadays, I would say EU law and the activities of the EU affect almost every aspect of our life. And I don't know if you have ever cooked milk. That's what happens if you cook milk. It's going to spill over. And in EU integration theory, there is this notion of a spillover effect, that cooperation in one field automatically leads to cooperation in other fields. And so at the beginning, we had cooperation in the field of coal and steel. And nowadays we are discussing topics of migration. We discuss the Green Deal. We discuss regulation on artificial intelligence. So the level of EU integration has gone quite far. And if I remember it correctly, it was Andreas Maurer who once organized an event, and I think, please correct me, the title was How to Get an Egg Out of a Pancake. And it was about Brexit. And this should show you that the level of milk is nowadays so high that if you want to get out of this integration process, as the United Kingdom in the case of Brexit, it's almost impossible. I mean, we know they did it, but of course, working closely together leads to the fact that countries are mutually depending on each other in a positive sense. And again, that's what has so far avoided war amongst the EU member states. So at the very beginning, this process was only about coal and steel, and step by step, more competences have been shifted to the European level, and conclude that there are some areas where nowadays only the European Union can make new laws. So we normally call them EU directives or EU regulations. So I will explain you how EU institutions can make legislation afterwards, but let's first have a look at those fields where it's only the European Union. And that's the list which you can see here on the top left-hand side. So for example, customs duties, that's an exclusive EU competence. Also monetary policy for those countries who have the euro, common commercial policy, and so on. There is a second long list, and in the second category, it's both the EU and the member states who can make legislation. And for obvious reasons, I have highlighted environmental policy as the one field where we have national rules and also EU rules. Maybe another field where you unconsciously are aware of that is consumer protection, where you have a lot of protection as a consumer, for example, in Austrian laws, but those the rights that you enjoy basically go back to EU directives. And last but not least, we have one category where the European Union has not a lot to say, so you can only support the member states, coordinate them, or submit here on the left-hand side on the bottom of the slide. So again, the message is at the beginning, the EU integration was mainly about coal, mainly about coal and steel. Nowadays, it affects almost every part of our life. And from a legal perspective, the question is it only the EU who can make legislation, the EU and the member states, or is it mainly the member states and the EU can only support, coordinate, or supplement? So the objective of this presentation is not to become too technical, and I'm not going to sing the European anthem for you. But those, as you might know, are the symbols of the European Union. And quite soon, on the 9th of May, we are going to celebrate Europe Day, because that was precisely the day when Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister at the time, presented his plan, elaborated by Jean Monnet, hence Jean Monnet chairs, not to punish the Germans and not to give rise to a next World War, but to work together. And again, I think after having been attacked by the Germans, that was a quite remarkable offer and a very wise decision. I don't want to go into too much details, but very briefly want to mention the motto of the European Union, United in Diversity, because very often the EU is accused of over-regulating, which is not really true, and at least it needs a differentiated analysis. Maybe we can discuss that in the discussion. But I guess the motto very or describes the situation of EU integration very well, because there is still diversity, and the EU does not aim to regulate every aspect of our life, but there are clearly examples where it makes sense to have a uniform approach. And again, just to pick out the obvious example, climate change cannot be enabled by one country only. It needs 27. Sometimes maybe we would even conclude that we would need a worldwide form of cooperation to safeguard the environment. So if I mentioned that the EU can take certain decisions, and we've seen on the previous slides when it can do so, let's have a look at the EU institutions. And just for the sake of completeness, I want to emphasize that I'm going to focus right here in blue. So what does EU decision-making look like in a nutshell? And again, you will hear more details later on, also from Andreas Maurer. So we have one institution, the European Commission, and I'm going to tell you more about those institutions right in a minute. So we have one institution who has the power of proposing new legislation. That is very important, because often, as I said, the EU is accused of regulating too much. There are actually some examples where the Commission has to be persuaded that it should come up with a new legislation. And then the task is being handed over to other institutions, and you could call them to the two chambers of a parliament. And yes, terminology is a little bit confusing, because the one chamber is called European Parliament, the second chamber is called Council of the European Union or Council of Ministers. But again, those two institutions have to agree. If they do not agree, there is no new EU law. Now, how do those institutions look like? Well, first of all, we have the European Commission, 27 commissioners, one from each member state. We have the European Parliament, which is going to be elected in Austria on the 9th of June this year. So more than 700 members of parliament from the 27 member states. And I cannot show you a picture concerning the Council of Ministers, because depending on the subject matter, let it be foreign affairs, let it be social policy, let it be environmental issues or agriculture, always the competent ministers for that subject matter would meet to take decisions. So again, and here we already have some of the maybe confusing terminology. We have, as I just explained, the European Commission making proposals, and the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers adopting them. And yes, you can vote for the European Parliament directly, and for the other chamber, so to say, you can only vote indirectly, because you can vote for your national parliament, and out of the national parliament you would have the ministers or the government which is chosen, and then indirectly you can also determine who is meeting in the Council of Ministers. We have another entity, and again here the terminology is unfortunately a little bit confusing. It's called European Council, and I will very briefly mention that at the end of my slides. Those are the heads of state and government, and they are not directly involved in the decision making, but they give the great political guidelines. The other bodies, but for reasons of time, I will cut that short. So what about the European Commission? As I just mentioned, on the 9th of June, at least in Austria, you can vote for the European Parliament. And after the European Parliament, we would then have a new Commission, 27 commissioners, one from each member state, and they are appointed by the European Council. That's why I also very briefly mentioned the European Council, and with approval of the European Parliament. So you can see a system of checks and balances linking those various institutions. Actually, the number of people working in the European Commission is relatively small. So I think it's a very, I would say, efficient institution. And the European Commission has basically two tasks. As I already mentioned, they have the only right to suggest new legislation, and they are also called the guardian of the treaty. So they have to make sure that member states are not breaching EU law. I guess the one statement which takes complexity, but still this institution is doing, they are representing the interest of the whole European Union. So not particular interests, but the interests of the whole European Union, and therefore it's also important, as stated in EU law, that their members are independent. So a commissioner coming from Austria may not represent the interests of Austria. That is very important. Obviously, the most important institution now for this webinar is the European Parliament. There will be 720 members of the European Parliament coming from the 27 member states. And since 1979, they are directly elected again every 5 years, and this year on the 9th of June. As I already mentioned, the European Parliament, together with the Council of Ministers, they make EU law. They are in charge of legislation. And as you can see, that's an overview from The Economist. The turnout in elections, I guess maybe worldwide, but here at least for some key member states in Europe, has declined over the year. And if you look to the right-hand side, you can see that this was also true for the European Parliament. We could even say it was a race to the bottom. So since the first elections, 1979, every 5 years, the participation of voters constantly declined. It came to a halt in 2014, so that was roughly the same percentage as 5 years ago. And last time there was a campaign called This Time I'm Voting. It was possible to convince more Europeans to use their democratic right, and it was 50% roughly. Hopefully this year it's going to be more, who knows. And maybe also you, if you encourage colleagues to make use of their right to vote, can help to increase this percentage. As I said, the main focus is in the European Parliament, but not to forget about the Council of Ministers, because that's the second chamber of the European legislative, so to say. And here we have the ministers who are meeting. Currently, we have Belgium as a country chairing the meetings, so organizing the agenda and all of that. And as you can see, that will change to Hungary at the beginning of July. I will skip that for reasons of time. And last institution mentioned here is the European Council. So those are the heads of state and government, the big summit meetings, who produce documents which sometimes have been compared to royal proclamations, so that those are political statements. And again, this institution is also important because it has a major role in forming the Commission. And again, to simplify, as a first step, we will have EU elections, then the forming of a commission, and there the European Council will play an important role. And I've just mentioned that this institution was also involved in this debate of Spitzenkandidaten, and I guess that's a good keyword to stop my presentation. and to hand over to Andreas, because that falls in his field, the debate about Spitzenkandidaten, and in which way that is linked to the European Parliament. So I stop my presentation. I start your presentation. And
I will then tell you when next slide. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I share it and I
Yep.
try to mute myself.
Thank you very much. So no introduction, further introduction, and just continuing on what Markus just finished on the issue of Spitzenkandidaten, because at this moment right now we are competing with another event. That is why I have looked on my other screen, because at the moment the so-called Maastricht debate is going on. That is the debate between the so-called Spitzenkandidaten, the Elefantenrunde, if you want. That's actually also web streamed on Politico. It is a disaster. Because imagine, this is one of two trans-European televised debates between the lead candidates of the European political parties. And right at this moment, the web stream of Politico has 2,440 participants across Europe. It's nothing. Yeah, and that tells you something about the importance, or what voters do think about that issue of the lead candidates. There's not so much behind. That's such for this issue of the lead candidate system. Markus, please, the next slide, because I first look into Parliament as such. So Parliament. Markus already touched on that. When it's one of the two chambers, it has gained a lot of legislative powers, control powers during the last 25 years, thanks to some treaty amendments, first with the Treaty of Maastricht, and then treaties of Amsterdam, Nice, and the last one, 2009, the Treaty of Lisbon, which granted the European Parliament in the end 85 areas of binding decision-making of the Council of Ministers, so the second chamber, which is always there to decide, but that's the body who is always in the legislative field. And in 85 areas of the Council, the European Parliament shares, together with the Council, the right to co-decide. That sounds much. It is much. One should not forget that there are also a lot of areas at the moment, 112 areas of potential council decision-making powers where the European Parliament has no role at all. So it is even not informed ex post or ex ante. So it sounds not so good. Next slide. If you look into the reality, it's a little bit better. First slide was, let's say, if you want, on the sociologists call that the opportunity structures, so the Gelegenheitsstrukturen. What the treaties provide for as a potential for the European Parliament. And here you see what the European Parliament made out of that since 1987. 87 was the right of the Single European Act, so the treaty reform which gave birth to the European Single Market Program. And you can see, in red are those legislative files which have been adopted after the consultation of the European Parliament, which is also a legislative power. Parliament is asked by the Council if it agrees or not, and if it wants to have some changes. And building on that, Parliament also can at least block and obstruct the Council from quick decision-making. In green, that are the columns which we usually take as the most important ones on legislative dossiers which are subject to the so-called ordinary legislative procedure. That is a procedure which in theory can run in 3 readings, so first, second, third reading by Parliament and Council. Usually now, about 90%, more than 90% of the files are adopted at first reading stage in something which is called a trilogue. So this share has increased in the first 10 years, and then it remained rather stable. And then you have another column, the purple one, that are the legislative assents of the European Parliament, which people tend to forget sometimes. Parliament has to give its assent or reject to give its assent to all international agreements area of the European Union on finances, the structural funds, the cohesion funds. All these things are subject to a final yes or no of the European Parliament. And that has also increased after the Treaty of Lisbon. Next slides. Why is Parliament's participation rate not as big as people usually would expect? Or I think when now during the political campaign, you will hear very often from candidates that the European Parliament is extremely important because it participates in nearly all fields of legislation, which, as you have seen in the slides, is not completely true. It does not really matter so much because for many members of the European Parliament and candidates, there are fields where the Council decides alone without the European Parliament, where the European Parliament does not want to participate at all. And for example, in competition policy, day-to-day policy making, in day-to-day policy making of agriculture and fisheries. So when the Council decides on new intervention prices or something, it's very technical decisions where Parliament never asked to participate. The other reason for this relatively low rate is that the overall amount of decision-making in the European Union, so the production of legally binding law, started to increase enormously until the 86-87, and since then it decreased, and now it's oscillating around a status quo of more or less 500 legislative dossiers per year, which sounds not so much compared to many member states. Yeah, it's quite much. I mean, in this legislature, there were many dossiers with regard to the Green Deal, transportation and mobility, home judicial affairs. But I mean, it's not increasing as people usually, especially Eurosceptics, always denounce. They say, yeah, Brussels is a huge bureaucracy producing more and more laws which are over-consuming our citizens' interests, which is complete nonsense. Next slide. You can see, I mean, what is increasing is a certain instrument of the Council, not so much of the European Parliament, and that are decisions, also called Beschlüsse. That is the only area where the production of decisions has increased continuously over time. The other areas, those which are denounced very often by the skeptics as being, let's say, the mirror of over-bureaucracy of the European Union, the regulations and the directives are decreasing. Regulations, they are decreasing enormously. I mean, it's a free fall, and directives were never so important as they are usually being perceived. What has increased over time are decisions, and usually most of the decisions are done by the Council alone without Parliament. There is a share where Parliament also participates, and so-called recommendations, which are nothing else than, yeah, as it sounds, a recommendation. Next slide. That are the simple ones. So for the regulations, the blue one is regulations adopted by Parliament and Council together, a slow increase, and then regulations adopted by the Council alone, a decrease. Next slide. For the directives, another picture. The EP Council directives have decreased over time. Council too. So I mean, there's not so much use anymore of this instrument. Less than 10 directives per year. Next slide. And then we come to the decisions. Where the European Parliament and the Council adopt decisions. For example, I mean, the Erasmus program or the Socrates program, that is a decision of the Council and the European Parliament. But what has increased enormously are decisions of the Council alone, which tries, let's say, to circumvent Parliament by referring to that instrument of decision-making. And when it's now, there's no debate about that. Next slide. To the debate why Parliament. That is the evolution of the political composition of the European Parliament since the first direct elections in 1979. You can see is there's a big block column always, and yeah, a purple-red one. Purple-red is the S&D. Above S&D is the left, and the black one are the Christian Democrats or the PPE. Both are losing in share with regard to the Conservative European Parliament since the last big Eastern enlargement continuously. Who is profiting from that decrease? First and foremost, the extreme right, or the conservatives and the extreme right, which are increasing their share, and I mean, they are expected to re-increase their share again for the next elections. That, of course, depends also on our vote. And for the Socialists and Democrats, they are losing seats to the Greens and also partly to the camp of the Liberals. Next slide, please. Which means that the traditional Grand Coalition, which already always existed since 1979, which was an informal coalition, of course. I mean, there was never a formal coalition agreement between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, but an informal one, which basically meant that these two political groups decided on who is going to become president of the European Parliament, and that also led to big grand coalition votes in the European Parliament in legislation. Now, as you can see, that coalition had some kind of a buffer. We call it a buffer of mavericks. So when you take, let's say, the highest column in 2004, that means that both the S&D and the Christian Democrats could survive with 130 members of their political groups, and they would still have a majority. And that is decreasing since 2004. I mean, since last elections, 2019, the first one, where it's not enough anymore. So since 2019, with Brexit, after Brexit, you can see the last three columns, both big groups, so the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, do not have enough members to vote in a coalition. They do need also legally now at least one partner, either the Liberals or the Greens, or the Liberals and the Greens, if you take into account that also in the larger groups, there are always some members who do vote against their political family. And that might become more critical for the next elections, because if the radical right wins more seats than the Liberals or the Greens, also this potential three-party coalition, so Christian Democrats and Social Democrats together with either the Greens or the Liberals, is not enough, and they would need to have really formally another political group to participate and to vote against the extremists, especially the extremists of the right. Next slide, please. That this kind of, I mean, end of the honeymoon is over. Honeymoon between, let's say, the centrist parties together with the Liberals and the Greens, is also visible if you look into the plenary votes of the European Parliament over the last legislative term. But what I did here is each dot is a plenary vote on a legislative file which has been prepared by the Affairs Committee, which is a very politicized one, the Liebe Committee, so Home Digital Affairs Committee, which is also highly politicized, the Transport and Mobility Committee, which is rather calm, the Legal Affairs Committee, which is also a rather consensual committee, and the Inter-Committee, which is in between. So I only took there to have an example. And I took, okay, I take all legislative files which have been pre-cooked in these committees and then be subject to plenary vote for the adoption of a law. And what you can see is when all blue dots, which are above this threshold of 370, are votes where you have had a majority, a clear majority. The higher the blue dots are, the larger the majority is. And you can see, not all of them, but there are many, many votes where you have nearly 600, 700 members which do vote for the file, which means that you have much more than a grand coalition, that in these winning coalitions, you have basically all political groups except the right extremists of the IED, sometimes maybe the ECR, but usually all the others are in. That also may happen for, let's say, the highly debated files in climate and environmental issues. And it stopped, or it came to an end last year, towards the end of the year, visible for us, let's say ordinary citizens, when Parliament voted on the renaturation regulation, where the Christian Democrats produced some kind of a scandal, given the fact that the political group leader, Manfred Weber, asked each ordinary member of the environmental committee of his group how he or she would intend to vote on the renaturation law. And if the member said, yeah, I'm going to vote in favor, Weber told him, okay, then either you are ill or you are the group. And what Weber then did is full member of the environmental committee or substitutes. They were complete aliens. The only thing is they voted no. So, and that happened now, during the last months more often, that the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats are distancing themselves from each other, which on the one hand is some kind of a political campaign. They say, okay, at the end of the legislature, at the beginning of, let's say, the electoral campaign, political groups try to make clear what their differences are, and that there are differences in political ideological terms. Problem is that we, as the citizens, and also through the media, do get the information about these kind of votes, not as, say, the new normal of debate between left and right, but the baseline of the information is that shows that the European Parliament is incapable to adopt laws. It's dysfunctional. That's complete nonsense. Yeah, what is happening in political debates now is, yeah, okay, you have a thin majority, and these thin majorities now come to be seen. What we do not get from that is, let's say, a real transposition into political electoral campaign. I mean, if you look on the streets here in Austria, they have nothing. I was now in Germany, I'm living in Belgium, at least there, the debates, the campaign started, but even there, the campaign slogans are zero. I mean, it's, yeah, vote for Europe. Europe is us. We need Europe. Yeah, okay, everybody can tell you that. What I, as a voter, want to know, okay, what does it mean to have, let's say, a European Union inspired by the Greens, the left, the right, the Christian Democrats, the liberals? And are there differences? And if there are differences, then please make them clear so that I have a choice. I do not want to have the choice to vote for or against Europe. I mean, even Viktor Orban can argue that he's in favor of Europe. And that is not the issue. I want to have a choice to vote for a political one. So, and either a liberal one, a right wing. And that is something which is missing. It's not the first time. It is one of the problems of the European Parliament electoral campaigns, that the campaigns are rather depoliticized. Next slide, please. Yeah, that we can skip due to time. It's transposition. Now, what could be topics of the election campaign? And there are. I mean, there could be a campaign, a real debate between those which are opting for a continuous climate policy against those which are opting for a protection of the large agricultural industries. So a debate building on the actual debate inside Parliament on the renaturation regulation or on the fall of the pesticide regulation. These things happen. Next thing, climate policy against economic policy. Also, that is an internal debate of the European Parliament, but it's not translated to political campaign, and we could see it. The due diligence directive was adopted last Wednesday, and it was heavily debated, not only between members of the European Parliament, but also between member states. The agreement between the EU and Mercosur, it is hotly debated, also inside NGOs. But political parties do not profit from that potential debate and take their position on that. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is another issue which is hotly debated between left and right. but it is not transposed into political campaign. And that, I think, is a disaster. Next topic would be closing borders and liberal migration policy. If, let's say, the centrist parties do not wake up and start to focus on that issue, then it will be a free play of the radical right-wing parties, because they are taking over on that subject and calling for more closing of borders and having more stricter border control measures against asylum seekers and so on. And I do not hear any serious word from any other political party against that argument. Next issue is the role of the European Union in the world. So what is our relationship with the US, Russia, China, or the global South? Do we want to be partner, vassal, or sovereign? And what does that mean? And I could expect from each political group, political party, different political choices. And what I think citizens are missing is really a positioning on the choice. The final, it's my final one, there might be other issues, is solidarity versus subsidiarity. I mean, there is not only subsidiarity in the room. I know that people, especially in Bavaria and Austria, do like their term, subsidiarity and regions. I mean, the other side of the coin is solidarity. And we will see that the European Parliament we are going to vote now in June will be the European Parliament which is providing its assent in the mid of the legislature on the next cohesion fund. And this next cohesion fund will have to take into account not only the 27 member states, but quite Balkan countries and board as potential new members. And then we'll have to speak in some means in financial terms. I think it's fine. Look at if there's another slide. I don't think so. No. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'm happy to discuss.